Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to everybody to this ISKI Expert webinar. I'm delighted to have with me today Fran O'Hara, and the topic of the webinar today is user stories and effective QA. So a little bit first of all about the webinar and things like asking questions. If you want to ask a question, pop it into the question box on the right-hand side. And at the end of the webinar, then we'll have a Q&A session, and Fran will do his best to answer all of the questions that you have. If we don't get around to answering your questions, then don't worry, then we can contact you separately. And what we will also do is make a recording of the webinar available. So if there's anything that you want to catch up on afterwards, you'll be able to, and of course, you'll be able to share it with your colleagues, because I know it's going to have some useful and exciting information in it. So my name is Debbie Archer. I'm Managing Director for ISQI Limited, and we'll tell you a little bit about ISQI Limited in a moment. And as mentioned, I'm delighted to have with me Fran O'Hara, who is from Inspire Quality Services based in Ireland, and Fran will tell you a little bit about himself in a moment. A little bit about ISKI, the International Software Quality Institute, first of all. We were established back in 2004 in Potsdam in Germany, and indeed that's where we have our International Service Centre, a fantastic team over there who are more than happy to help and support people with all of their certification and examination needs. I'm based here in London, ISKI Limited. We also have our BV based in the Netherlands and our Inc. based over in Boston in America. We service the world. We have invigilators who can supervise exams around the globe, and examinations are in multiple languages as well. And currently we're certifying about 30,000 people per year. Our certifications, a quick overview for you here. We offer the full ISTQB portfolio of examinations. They are available through multiple delivery channels, which I'll just cover in a moment. We also have some complementary certifications from A4Q, who is our certification partner in Selenium design thinking, and really popular at the moment, AN software testing. We additionally have some certifications in Agile, which again, you can find out more about on our website. Other partners include IREB for requirements engineering, UXQB for usability, ISAQB for software architecture, TMMI Foundation for test maturity, because I tend to have a lot of testers actually joining these sessions. I'm often asked about exam delivery at the end of these webinars, so not that we're talking about certification necessarily. This is much more a content-driven webinar, but nevertheless, I still get questions. Exam delivery options, Pearson VUE test centres. Keep an eye on the Pearson VUE website for which test centres are opening up again at the moment. Certainly if you're in the UK, then there's good coverage now. Flex, our remote proctored exam option, is available on all of our ISTQB exams at the moment, and I've popped in a link there if you would like to have a look at them. Once we get back to training, paper-based and an exam in classroom with an invigilator will hopefully start to take place again also. So that's enough about ISKI. I could talk to you all day about us because there's lots to say, but that's not why you're here. So it's my absolute pleasure to pass over to Fran O'Hara, who's going to talk to you about user stories and effective QA. Over to you, Fran.
Yeah, here we go. Hello, everyone. You're all very welcome. Thanks a lot, Debbie, and thanks a lot to ISKI for inviting me to give this talk. As the title suggests, it'll be about user stories, and I don't know about you, but I'm sitting in sweltering heat here at the moment. I don't know if it's like that where you are, but I'm doubly impressed that you're signing in on a day like this. So thanks a lot. So I'm going to talk, I said it'd be an action-packed session, so a content-filled section. So let's get stuck into it. When I talked about, I think I thought about this first, I thought about effective testing of stories and so on. But then I thought what would be more useful really would be to kind of spin it out a bit further and talk about QA in a broader sense. Now, I'm not being too purist about the definition of QA and so on versus QC, etc. I just wanted to emphasize, in addition to testing, the importance of building quality into stories as well as testing it as well. And I think this resonates as well with what I see in the industry a lot in agile environments about the role of testers being seen more so, perceived more so as quality advocates in addition to running tests. So I think it kind of fits that bill as well. So my background is both development and test. One stage I had a startup, a testing services company that was acquired by Sagetti. And now I'm kind of doing independent kind of training, coaching, mentoring in two areas, really, Agile and testing. And we do the ISTQB and we do Scrum training and so on. Some of it certification based, some of it customized, and mentoring as well, both Agile teams and test functions and so on. And it's all pretty much virtual now, when I've been amazed in a sense how well that's going. I've already done foundations and Scrum, and I'm getting better feedback than I get when I'm actually face to face with these people. So I don't know what that says. Maybe I'm not great to look at in face. So anyway, let's get on to collaboration and Agile. You know, we had Alistair Coburn. I invited him as a keynote to an Agile conference we run here in Dublin called Agile Tour. And he distilled Agile down to a single word. And that word is collaboration. And from a point of view of QA and effective QA, it begins and ends with collaboration. So it's to build quality in to the stories. We need whole team thinking to achieve our quality goals. The whole team needs to be responsible for quality. Everyone on the team needs to be performing testing. So that's kind of the starting, I think, an ending point for this whole talk is the importance of collaboration. And when I say collaboration, who am I talking about doing the collaborating? I'm talking about developers with the various technical competencies, and I'm talking about QA, test, I'm talking about the business. And it's really the collaboration between the three of these that leads to a kind of a greater level of agility, put it that way. Collaboration is the heart of Agile. And the big thing Agile has brought is the business engagement here, and the value focus that Agile has, supported by having business engaged. In Scrum, which is probably the one I'll refer to most, the framework that is used most widely, this takes the form of the product owner, representing the customer and focusing and prioritizing based on value, based on achieving better outcomes. So we now have technical people that are directed in the way of value, rather than, let's say, being overly engineering led. So it's that collaboration, it's the balance between all of that. And of course, developers and testers working much more closely now as part of a team, rather than being seen as separate in different silos. And of course, DevOps has come along, of course, as well. And therefore, there's a fourth circle, which is the ops guys. They got left out in the original Agile push. So now it's ops are included there as well. So how do we collaborate? Well, there are many ways, but a kind of a core, a key critical approach would be to use user stories. So it's a vehicle for collaboration. We have the problem space, which is the customers, the users, our product management people, domain experts. They know what's required. They know what the needs are. They know what's wanted. And on the solution space, you have the techies. They know what software can do these days. They know the technology, what it can do. And it's when the two come together that we get innovation, that we get better solutions to meet the key needs, the important needs. And for that to work, we cannot be handing over a requirement specification on the left-hand side and communicating through that in written documentation to the guys on the right-hand side here. We need to have conversation. And for that conversation to occur, we need a certain level of uncertainty and ambiguity that needs to be explored in conversation. But conversation kind of needs something to latch on to. It needs something to kind of have the conversation around and about. These are referred to as, from sociology, as boundary objects or social objects. And when I started this talk a few minutes ago, one of the first things I talked about was the weather. And in Ireland, the weather is the main social object that breaks the ice and gets conversation going. In Agile, the main social object is the user story. Okay, so it's a common language to kind of traverse the two areas of the problem space and the solution space, because requirements have been the biggest problem area historically. The understanding and conveying and communicating of requirements so that better solutions can be made that actually are the right system for the requirements. So this is helping to solve the problem in Agile, communicating through conversation and building that conversation around user stories. And what we're trying to do in terms of building quality in here to our understanding of requirements is preventing defects, because it's the single source of the key source of problems and costs in terms of rework on traditional projects. And testers play a key role in this communication and conversation as well, because testers tease out uncertainty and ambiguity because they need to know in concrete terms what this software is supposed to do. So the user story then typically has this template. As a certain type of user, there may be different user types. You know, I want some particular bit of functionality. I want to perform some task, but then also importantly, why do I want that to happen? The business benefit, the rationale for why I want that to happen. That gives the development team, the technical people, more context, more understanding, and therefore they'll come up with solutions that are a better match in the context that you're in. The acceptance criteria help define the boundaries of that story. They basically help define when a product owner will be happy that the story is complete, what has to be verified and checked. Examples make great acceptance criteria. When the system adheres to these examples and gives the results associated with these examples, then the story is done, it's working. So just take a little example then. Let's get of stories, okay? Let's get a little more specific. So I want to talk about a cancellation feature. It's a simple hotel reservation system. This is a classic example, but I want to put a bit of a more detail into it here. So basically, you can make reservations, you can search, get pricing information, availability. They make a booking, you pay a deposit of 20%, and then there's a rewards club, and premium members get special benefits from time to time. But the one I want to focus on here is the cancellation feature. Customers can cancel. Premium customers, there's no charge. For non-premium, there's no charge if it's made well in advance. If it's not, then they're charged. All cancellations are notified to the customers with relevant information, and the hotel must also be notified. So the point here is this is what a product owner may come into a backlog refinement session with. A couple of lines that describes a feature. They may come in with a blank piece of paper, which I've seen as well, or they may come in with a kind of a description that's in the story user story template. But I often see this just coming in with a high-level description, and these high-level descriptions sometimes can be verbose. Sometimes it might be difficult to extract what the real requirements are. They can be vague, they can be missing important things. So I think what I've seen has been very useful is to describe this feature as an epic in the standard template with acceptance criteria. And to generate this, we have a conversation around that feature. Testers are very good at asking these kind of questions. So when it says they're charged, well, how much? Is it the full deposit? What does well in advance mean? Can we, how do we confirm cancellation? You know, how do we notify the hotel? When do we notify the hotel? What about if they don't cancel but they don't show up? So based on that conversation, we could, concisely define that feature using the template of a user story. Now we know just from looking at this intuitively that it's an epic. It's a large, uncertain story. It's going to have to be decomposed. For some people, the word epic equates to a feature, more or less what I've got here. So for some people, an epic is much larger than a feature. For some people, an epic is much smaller than a feature. So people have different terminology. Here, I'm just talking about a feature and I'm defining it in the user story template, and we know it's a very large uncertain story, so I'm referring to that as an epic. So we have the user, a hotel rewards member, and they want to cancel a reservation and they want to avoid being charged. And these are the various acceptance criteria that came out of that discussion for the original feature and the discussion that we had around it. So it's 7 days is the timing, it's the full 20%. We're going to email the user and email the hotel, and we have to do it fairly quickly. And we decided that this one in red over here is outside the boundary of this particular large story. It's going to be handled somewhere else. There'll be another story to deal with that, another feature to deal with that. So looking at this though, we could have replaced these by examples. They make excellent acceptance criteria. In behavior-driven development, BDD, typically what's used with stories is scenarios, small scenarios, using the structure given, when, then, which effectively, again, are examples. So again, experiment with the best approach for you in your context. But let's say this we know it's an epic, either intuitively or after we've estimated it, and we want to decompose it. So how do we decompose it? How do we slice this? Well, the simplest way to slice is to extract out some of the acceptance criteria and make them standalone stories. Therefore, this particular epic will shrink and become smaller. So obviously here we could take out the email confirmation to the user, the hotel email and the timing of that. We could split by user type, premium and non-premium. So we could end up with something that looks like this. I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can see, you know, that's one pattern effectively for decomposition. Splitting by user type, extracting acceptance criteria, making them standalone stories, and so on. But there's a lot more ways that you could slice. So, for example, if we looked at, you know, even the first one here, and we still thought it was too big, we could say, well, maybe there's a lot of work in the different browsers that may be being used by these premium members. So maybe we just focus on Chrome as a premium member using Chrome. I want, and then we'll have a separate story for other browsers or one individually for each browser. So we've split that up further because there was too much work to do it all at once for all browsers. Or maybe as well we split it by doing the first one for one specific hotel, and then we have stories for the rest of the hotels. It depends where the major effort is and how we slice it so that they're relatively evenly sized and in a small enough range that we can work with. Maybe we return a deposit to one bank and then we expand that to other banks. Maybe we do it for one credit card and then we do it for a second credit card. So there's many ways you can look at slicing, because the key point to remember is a user story is an increment of development told from a user point of view. Okay, we're not going to necessarily release a user story. It doesn't have to be a fully intact feature. It's full features that we typically look at delivering to the customer that are potentially deliverable, making up a minimal marketable feature set or whatever your context refers to. So it's the accumulation of stories, it's the combination of stories that leads to something that you know, an end user would actually use as a, let's say, full task or a full feature. So if we think in those terms, it's about slicing up that overall functionality into small, thin slivers of functionality, yet keeping the value focus. So from a testing point of view, if we just take one of those stories, let's say the second one there, in terms of testing this, okay, what do I do? I can see there's two acceptance criteria here. Well, I definitely want to check that they're addressed. So I could just run two test cases, one for each. So let's say before and after 7 days, and in one case there's a 20% deposit charge, in the other case it's returned. So I could say two test cases, hey, we've got the story covered. However, from a testing point of view, we want to focus on quality risks, product risks, because you know, it's a principle of modern testing, risk-based testing. Every time we test something, we're trying to think about what could go wrong, and we test to see if we can reduce that risk, reduce the chance of that risk occurring. So not all risks are equal, of course. So there may be some risks that are more important to test, and there's other risks we won't bother testing. But really, whether we explicitly identify risks or whether we just do it internally, internalize it ourselves individually, we are thinking risk when we think about creating and designing, analyzing and designing test cases. So if you look at this, these may be a number of things that might strike you if you're a tester, thinking about, well, you know, what could go wrong here? What are the risks with this reservation cancelling for non-premium? Well, maybe there could be delays in the deposit. Maybe the right amount won't be returned. Maybe it won't be exactly the 20%. Maybe there's rounding errors. Maybe the bank will charge and therefore the customer won't get their full deposit back. Maybe it won't work in certain cards. What about if it's sterling rather than euro? What about the 7-day limit doesn't work? Is it working days? Is it calendar days? What about if it spans year end, etc., etc., etc.? Now, some of these may be non-issues. In which case there's no testing required, but some of them may be high risk. They have a high impact if they occur. There's maybe a high likelihood that it might happen. So, you know, based on this, we may do much broader, expansive testing than just a simple check, kind of happy path test of the acceptance criteria. And also you can see from this that, you know, when we actually think about the test that we would design based on the risks, it raises a lot of questions as well in relation to the requirements. So in other words, we're finding defects simply by, in the requirements, simply by thinking about the tests we want to run and the risks that those tests need to address. So the point of all of this really is, you know, is that risk is still a totally valid principle in modern testing and Agile and DevOps. So, you know, it's something that informs maybe the extent of testing that we need to do at a story level, and indeed at any level. Because if you were to expand, let's say, the things that could go wrong and categorize them, here's just a sample, you know, starter for 10 in terms of risks with what the overall feature may be as well, workflow aspects, environment configurations with different operating systems, non-functional stuff like performance if load is high, the hotel mightn't get notified, maybe there's usability. So, you know, the question when you start thinking about risk is, well, what do we want to test and where do we want to test it? So we may just do the testing of the story for the functional risks here when we're doing story level testing. All of these other may be done at a higher level of testing, maybe at feature level or system level type testing. Or some of this may be addressed, may be tested when we're actually doing the story level testing. The point I'm kind of making here as well is that sometimes teams are blinkered by stories. We start a sprint, we pull in a number of stories, and then we develop and test those stories. And in many cases, from a test point of view, we tend to miss or provide insufficient attention to that higher level, you know, some of which are articulated here in higher level risks. So story interaction, feature level, workflow level, and so on are things that sometimes get omitted from our test approach or from our practice because we don't see the wood for the trees when we're developing and testing stories. So that was just an example, taking a feature, talking about building quality in by using the template. And the other way we can build quality in is by ensuring that the story adheres to good criteria for building quality into a story. INVEST is a commonly used one from Bill Wake, and it's an acronym for these words here: independent, negotiable, and so on. So if our stories meet these criteria, there's a good chance we've built quality in and we've got some decent stories. So they're independent of each other. We've minimized dependencies in terms of scope and so on. So therefore, excuse me, therefore the product owner can select them in any order based on business value priorities. It's not a written contract or a spec. Negotiation, you know, means that, you know, it talks about what we need, not how we're going to do it. It's almost deliberately imprecise and open for negotiation. So it encourages conversation and collaboration so that we can negotiate the understanding of it. It has business value. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. We want to avoid stories that are only valued by developers because the point again is Agile is value focused. So when we talk about stories, it's you know, obvious therefore that we need to focus on the value of stories as they contribute to the overall value that we're trying to deliver and the outcomes we're trying to achieve. So value is a key one I want to talk about a bit further. We can estimate it. If we can't, we need to do a bit of research into get out more information like a spike so we can estimate it. And then small is a big one. Now, you know, small is a subjective word. So rules of thumb I sometimes come across are, you know, it's between like a day and 6 days effort roughly. And that might equate to our story point with Fibonacci sequence being 1 to 13. Or we decide that stories need to be small enough so that we can get somewhere between 6 and 10 stories per sprint for our team. Obviously, it scales based on team size to meet your definition of done, DOD. So yeah, I'll talk about small a bit more as well. And then we have testable. So again, using acceptance criteria really helps make it concrete, measurable, verifiable, testable. So looking at value, I think it's a key one because Agile is value focused, and we want to emphasize user stories over vertical stories over horizontal stories. Horizontal stories where it might be like as a UI developer I want, or there might be a story for the database part, the backend part, and so on. So they're horizontal slices based on your architecture, whatever the layers are in your architecture, as opposed to vertical slices based on business value. So if we have user stories, these are some of the things that we get from it, as opposed to architectural stories. The product owner will understand value. It'll help with the communication and collaboration between the development team and the product owner. They can prioritize better. Maybe 80% of the value comes from 20% of the stories. So like not all stories are equal. So maybe when we deliver those 20% of the stories, we'll have most of the business value that the customer wants, and maybe we'll move on to something more interesting. So it allows that kind of prioritization, and therefore we don't deliver software that nobody wants. It's one of the biggest sources of waste is developing unwanted software. So if we can have value-focused stories, we can prioritize on that basis, we're going to have much better outcomes. It becomes business-led rather than engineering-led, so we don't over-engineer stuff. We can get earlier delivery of customer value, get feedback from that, get feedback even within the sprints on how it's going with value-focused stories, rather than somebody has spent 6 weeks really designing part of the system with no functional changes, for example. And we can communicate with people about progress and forecast better in terms people understand. It supports DevOps in a sense because, DevOps has a deployment pipeline, and if there's garbage going into that pipeline, there'll be garbage coming out. So we want stories that are built-in quality and are valuable from that point of view as well. And also because we have stories that will have tasks associated with them to do back-end work, test work, and whatever, we could get more collaboration because we are working collectively as a team and parts of the members of a team to actually finish valuable stories. Whereas if you have more technical stories, there's a back-end story, then that guy's going to go off, do their thing in isolation, independently, in their silo, which is very contrary to whole team thinking and collaboration. The other one I want to talk then about is the small one, because it's kind of, a tricky one as well, cause lots of problems. See, large stories are probably going to span sprints, so they don't get finished in this sprint and therefore they slip into the next one. So what do? Do we give ourselves credit for the story in the next one and not this one? Do we give ourselves partial credit? Well, what's going to happen to our velocity as a result? It's going to be variable. But also, if we don't finish a story, large stories, we're not going to be able to achieve the goal of that sprint, and so we lose the whole concept of sprint. And the concept of done. What does done mean if stories are just sliding from sprint to sprint? So, if you look at the diagram up there on the right, there's a few. The worst case scenario, I think, is the development of a story spans sprints, and the testing of that story might be happening 2 or 3 sprints down the line, or the development is done in one sprint, but all the test is done in the second sprint. So test is running a sprint behind, and therefore it's not done until all of that testing is complete. And then they're going to be finding bugs in sprint 2, interrupting the work that the developers are doing in sprint 2, and so on. The most common situation I come across is here in the diagram. So the stories are big, but most of the sprint is spent developing them. And by the time then it comes to test, we've only got a day or 2 at the end of the sprint. So it's a mini waterfall, and it has all the problems of waterfall in that testing gets squeezed. We don't address the risk we would ideally like to address. We don't get the coverage we like to achieve. And the bugs we find, there's no time to fix them. So they spill over into the next sprint. So there's lots of problems with small stories. On the other hand, then, with large stories. On the other hand, then, small stories give you all these benefits. It allows you to prioritize better because you have smaller chunks. You can prioritize within sprints. So we can start working on the most important small story rather than we have one big story that we can't split up. There's better visibility. It's motivating to get something finished, to get a small story finished and move on to the next thing. More feedback. Because there's less work in progress, WIP. It supports a flow-based approach. Our cycle time comes down. I see a lot of people combining Kanban with Scrum these days as well, and it's along these lines, and it's enabled as well by smaller stories, and it enables a pull system, if you're familiar with that concept from Kanban. And in fact, Scrum is supposed to be a pull system where you pull in a scope of work. The development team are the only ones who make that decision, not the product owner. So you generally get more whole team thinking and collaboration with smaller stories. And it does take time to split them, but the deeper understanding that it comes from that discussion and splitting is very positive. So I'm not going to go into any of this, but to hear more is reference to give you more ideas about how you might go about splitting stories, to get stories that are the right size, that also are vertical. Because one of the reasons I see teams using horizontal, technical, architectural stories is that they kind of give up on splitting the functional story or epic, and they find it difficult to split it any further. And then the logical thing that they see, the thing that they've always done, is to think in terms of their technical tasks. So it splits into technical tasks and technical stories effectively at a much earlier point in time. And really, it's only because we didn't actually, get the experience, we didn't acquire the expertise in slicing those stories up into smaller vertical slices and getting them to the size that we want them. So Alsa has a great little exercise that you can do as a team, facilitated, say, by a Scrum Master in slicing. And then there's one here from Richard Lawrence. He has a number of detailed kind of splitting patterns that you could apply that may help in different situations for different types of epics and stories. Mike Cohn has one called Spider, which obviously relates to as well to that, but he groups it into five areas in terms of, for example, with the paths one, when you look at that and you draw a flow chart, maybe there's multiple paths. Maybe you can pay with PayPal versus a credit card. So, each path could be a story, or you could pull out each step in a path as a story. So there's different kind of patterns again here that might help you when you're trying to split your stories to smaller vertical slices, so that you achieve those two key elements of building quality into good stories: value and small. Yeah. So when do we do all this? We do this in backlog refinement. And I just want to make a couple of points about the three amigos. This is something that's used fairly widely. It comes, BDD, behavior and development, uses it quite a bit, but I see it used in other environments as well. The equivalent in Scrum is product backlog refinement, where the whole team refine features to epics to stories and estimate them. The three amigos is simply a version of that, where you have a representative from the business, development, and QA. The reason I'm showing this slide is because there are there's different ways of doing it, and there are some risks with those different ways of doing it. If you interpret the three amigos as it replaces backlog refinement, and literally there's one person from the business, the PO, there's one, say, lead developer type, experienced developer type, and there's one tester, QA type. It's three people, very efficient. Yeah, you'll get to a decent set of stories pretty quickly. But then the problem is, if you just introduce them into the sprint and start working on them as a whole team, the rest of the team have missed out on all of that understanding. So that's obviously a scenario that I wouldn't advise people to use three amigos in, or a way to use it. A more common one and a much better one would be to do the three amigos as a primer to product backlog refinement, so that the input into the full team product backlog refinement is much better, and therefore product backlog refinement is more efficient, but still allowing for that kind of ownership, that kind of collaboration to potentially refine the stories further based on the whole team having that discussion and the knowledge sharing that will occur from that discussion around those stories as well, and the estimation thereof. Yeah. Other projects I've seen is where the only people who are going to work on a feature are the ones who actually do the three amigo session. And again, that may make sense in your context, but it kind of goes slightly against the idea of just-in-time self-organizing. So we end up focusing on finishing the most important stuff rather than predefining the splits within the team based on what people are going to work on. In Scrum, people, self-assign tasks so that the whole team thinking and collaboration and swarming around problems, it goes slightly against that. So again, I just wanted to highlight that, to the interaction between the three amigos, whether it's one representative, whether it's multiples, whether effectively it's the whole team, just to be aware of the interplay with product backlog refinement. Yeah. In terms then of if you don't build, if you're unaware of the kind of quality criteria we've been talking about and the importance of building quality in, then bad habits can tend to form. I like this slide here, this picture here. Maybe it's because I'm a reformed smoker, I don't know. But so just give some examples here again. What's wrong with these stories? Here's a few examples. As a bank teller, I want to save the list of today's customers so that later I can copy, print, or email. So the thing though here is when I look at this, I'm going, well, actually, it sounds like what the bank teller wants, is to be able to save, copy, print, and so on. So the structure, it's not really the result or the value, the benefit they're going to get from it. So it might be better to phrase it as I want to save, copy, print, and email the list. That's kind of, you want all that functionality. And then the only question is, well, why do you want all that functionality? And if we make some assumptions, maybe that all of this is needed in terms of who today's customers were and so on by internal auditing, well, maybe that's why this has all been done, saved and printed and emailed, so that we're compliant. But if we did that, of course, then it's a really big story. It's an epic, so we'd want to decompose it into the individual points. But this particular story, therefore, potentially is breaking the size, the small one, is breaking the value one because the rationale isn't clear in terms of invest, There's another one, as a developer, I want to finalize the database. So obviously here, this is a technical horizontal type a story rather than a user story. So ideally, you'd be able to remove this and evolve the database as part of other stories. So we're talking about, we're talking about it from the point of view of product infrastructure. And, do we do that all that infrastructural work, or do we incrementally do it in support of stories as we evolve the features of the system? And that is the approach that's advocated. It doesn't, we need to try and do that, basically. Sometimes it does not make sense, and you need to have a technical story, an enabler for subsequent user stories. So really it's up to the team to, again, experiment with this. But as much as possible, you're trying to keep that vertical slicing, and you're trying to, evolve the infrastructure underneath it as needed to deliver those pieces of value, rather than spending a whole chunk of time building a lot of infrastructure that ultimately may not be needed. So we want to use real end users rather than technical stories. Yeah. It's not an online customer. I want to locate previous food orders. So again, it's not really so that you want to see the list. You want to see the save so you can reuse it, making ordering more faster and accurate. It's probably a better way. So, it may seem, trivial, but the way in which these things, capture the conversation and the understanding, I've seen it turn out to be really crucial, because some misunderstandings end up, you go off and you build the wrong solution because you've misinterpreted what was needed or the rationale for it and why it's needed, and therefore you end up coming up with a suboptimal solution. Here's another one. You look at this and you go, okay, does this make sense? So maybe, why does the participant want a prominent call to action? It's really the training manager, for example, that might have this need to encourage participants to fill in a review of the course. Why? To get more feedback and whether the courses are going well, that type of thing. By the way, I forgot to mention, all of the stories I've talked about so far, they don't meet the testable criteria because they don't have acceptance criteria. This one has acceptance criteria. However, when we look at it, we can see we're kind of breaking the negotiable principle here as well. We're getting into the solution. It's much too implementation specific. It's no longer the what, it's the how. So putting a flag in the top right-hand corner and so on. We want to leave the implementation and the solution to the team, as opposed to dictating the way the implementation. So we would, the requirement is to view and select from available languages, and the team will come up with the best solution for that, in collaboration, of course, but not being dictated to by the business side, for example, there. Okay, so moving on just a little bit then to the test approach. Everything starts at risk, as I've already alluded to. And I just wanted to show testing user stories within the context of the big picture. Because as I say, sometimes people get blinkered by stories and they don't think about the broader quality risks and the best approach to address the various risks that you've got. So I'm sure for those of you who haven't come across these concepts, apologies, but I'd suggest you go look into them. But the concept of the testing quadrants, from Biomarek, and here's a flavor of this from Lisa Crispin and Janet Gregory. But there's lots of flavors of this. There's lots of flavors of the automation pyramid, originally from Mike Cohn. And this is talking about the kind of the types of testing, the kinds of testing, the levels of testing, the kind of techniques you might use. Some of them are business focused, some of them are techie focused. And this is talking about the different levels of automation. At the highest level, you have, put it this way, the idea with the pyramid is to show that most of your tests should be at the lower levels. Why? Because the lower the level you are, like with unit tests, the easier those tests are to write, the faster they are to run, the earlier you're going to get the feedback, and the easier they're going to be to maintain. So they have the highest return on investment of any type of automation. And the GUI layer, you can't write them until after you have the GUI, so the feedback's going to be slower. They're more difficult to write, they're slower to run, they're more difficult to maintain, they're brittle, they break a lot. And the API service layer is somewhere in between, and it allows us to access the functionality and test it through some technical interface. And this is typically what's used to test at the story level. So the story testing fits in here from an automation point of view, typically, and it fits in here in terms of creating story tests, they're written first, to guide development. And with examples are helping there as well. And there's an interplay between the two of these, as we talked about, the acceptance criteria, the examples, the writing of the tests, the expanding on the basic set of acceptance criteria tests. But the key thing here as well is what I like about this flavor of the quadrants is they're written first, because creating those test cases first, you're going to be in a position then for developers to know that these tests have to pass. If this input is provided, this expected result should occur. So a developer knowing this at an earlier stage as they're starting to do the implementation is very valuable, because it'll help prevent defects. Why? Because it clarifies. Test cases are examples. Examples become test cases. Test cases are requirements. The software is required to do this. When I give it this input, it's required to provide this output. So, the actual running of tests is key, obviously, against stories, but the actual design of those tests up front is, the timing of it is key as well. At the story level, we'd be doing potentially exploratory testing as well at the story level. So the examples, story tests, exploratory tests, at the level of the functional story are typically part of that overall picture, compared to things like usability testing, performance, low-level testing, and so on, which are, you need to create your own version of this in terms of, well, what are your quality risks, and therefore, what does this look like for you? This is just an example. And then we decide then, based on, this is our test approach, what risks do we have? How are we going to address them? What's our version or flavor of the quadrants? And then what's our strategy going to be for automation of those various tests? And therefore, what are we going to do within sprint? Are there any tests that we can't do until later sprints? I see that a bit in SAFE, for example, the last sprint being a kind of an end-to-end type test sprint. What about testing that has to happen in parallel or outside the sprints? So this is all about test approach to deliver whatever good enough means for you in your context, the level of quality that you need. And then getting close to finishing now, I just wanted to talk here about, previously I talked about user story testing, right? Now, often that's referred to as acceptance testing. In other words, testing the acceptance criteria of stories, yeah? But be very careful with that term, acceptance testing. Not to confuse it, first of all, with user acceptance testing, which is really, high-level business confidence builder, or beta trials and so on. But also, what does it mean to you? Is it focused purely on stories, or is it broader? Is it focusing on the higher level of features and so on? Because we really have to be careful with our test approach that we're not being blinkered by the stories. We're testing at higher levels of abstraction. We're testing at the feature level, for example, story interaction, workflows, and all of that. So let me just run through this first of all from Lisa Crispin and Janet Gregory. I think it's a nice little visual. So it's acceptance testing focused on stories, put it that way here. The tests are written first, and it's a test-driven development approach, which means we're also automating, okay? So we have our feature with examples. We're splitting those up into stories, a bit like the cancellation one we talked about. And we're exploring examples. At the same time, we're developing the high-level acceptance tests. They may equate to our acceptance criteria. They may equate to given when then scenarios, but it's all in the space here about examples, test cases related to the story, acceptance criteria. It's all in the space, being very clear about what we have to check, basically. But then there's also then the expansion of those tests to a broader set of test space, maybe looking at edge cases, maybe looking at some of the risks that we talked about there with the cancellation story, the non-premium one. Maybe there are other risks and we need to expand those beyond the basic set of tests that cover just the core key elements of the story. And then maybe we want to automate those. And then, the developers doing their coding and unit testing. And when that's complete, we run those automated story level tests. All the time we're looking, identifying defects, preventing defects, whatever way you want to look at it. And then we may have an exploratory testing step here as well, where we're doing manual testing in exploratory mode to try and find faults that are more difficult to find by simple checks from automation. I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. And indeed, any other testing that we might need, a little bit along the lines of the risks I mentioned with that user story on cancellation. So a couple of points I want to make about this, though, is automation. You have to decide, how much of this you want to automate. Let's say we define a whole set of examples and tests we want to run. Do we then automate those only? Why are we automating? We're automating to get faster feedback, if we can, and we're automating to address our regression problem, okay? So it's a kind of there are costs with automation, but then there's going to be the benefits in terms of faster feedback or in terms of a good regression set. But we really have to be careful about automation, because if we end up with a lot of automated tests, it's going to end up costing us a lot to maintain them, to analyze them. Feedback is going to slow down. The benefits are going to reduce. So we kind of have to balance risk with cost here. And then we have to compare that, for example, with, you know, the role of exploratory. Should exploratory be covering some more of those kind of more unusual edge cases, or what? So if we have some tests here, there are a couple of approaches we could take, right? Would be to automate them all, right? And they all go into the regression pack, okay? But the risk with that is that the regression pack may expand a lot and have the problems I talked about there, maintenance and so on. We could take a subset, we could write them all, automate these tests, but only put a subset of them, let's say the core ones, the happy path ones, into our automation, our regression pack. So there are certain automated tests that we run once and we never run again, or we run them less frequently compared to running our regression pack, you know, for every check-in as part of our CI approach. So there's a couple of options here. You know, we either automate everything, put it into regression pack, we automate everything but only put some into the regression pack, or we decide up front that we're only going to automate the ones that are going to go into the regression pack and everything else is going to be done with exploratory. I've even seen teams that decide the first thing they want to do is exploratory testing, and based on the results of that and the improvements and fixes that occur from that, then they automate the basic set of tests they want to put into the regression pack. So a lot of it depends on how easy or otherwise it is to automate some or many tests, and the role of checks versus exploration, which is the next thing I want to talk about. And then I'm just about finished. So exploratory, there's a definition of it from Elizabeth Hendrickson. You know, it's simultaneous design and execution. Michael Bolton has definitions, and you know, very much about you know, trying to get information about the system, learning. You know, of what's of interest to the customers, reducing risk, confidence, discovering what's missing, overcoming biases. These are all kind of reasons. And the bottom line is that exploratory is one of the most productive ways to find bugs, compared, for example, to automated checks. So exploratory is a hugely valuable tool to have in your toolbox from the point of view of mitigating risk around stories and at higher levels as well. So we can do exploratory at the story level, we can do exploratory at the feature level, the workflow level. The approach that's I've seen work very well is time boxing, you know, session-based testing, time box to an hour, to charters for each session. The charter just gives kind of the overall objective of that session and what the focus is. And, you know, this can be done individually, can be done as a team, that can be done in pairs. And the kind of things we can focus on are a certain type of persona, you know, testing the software from that perspective, focus on workflows. We can use testing heuristics or principles or checklists that we want to use to support what we check in exploratory mode, what we test in exploratory mode. We have risk failure types, look at edge cases, try and generate the errors from the system. We could have a chart looking for around usability aspects, you know, and very much it's a reactive style of testing as opposed to predefining tests. We react to what we see. We think of things we never would have thought about. What if situations? What about if the user does things in an unusual sequence? And so on and so on. So it's a very powerful technique to find a lot of faults in a short space of time. You do have to have experience, and I guess the skills in exploratory as well, which can be learned. You have to have experience because you have to know whether you're observing a bug or a feature. Yeah. To know if you've got a problem when the system responds when you do something with it. In some quarters, its credibility has been questioned, or the management don't see it as a credible. We need to have documented tests, or we need to have 100% automation. But I think, you know, if you look at, let's say, the documentation aspect, that can something, the repeatability, to be able to reproduce bugs that you find, you need to maybe use tools to record what you're doing. Documentation, you may need that, for example, if you have some kind of regulations you need to support, like FDA regs, regulatory requirements. So again, a tool, I've seen tools that can just record, capture the charter, capture the session report, a description of the coverage, what was done, a traceability to the bugs that were raised in that session, and you know, the FDA have totally validated approaches like this. So from the point of view of credibility, that's misplaced. It is a highly professional, strategic use of a technique as part of your overall test approach to mitigate your risks, and needs to be thought through in terms of the blend and the timing of it relative to your automation, at both the story level and at higher levels. So I pretty much run out of time. So there's a quick summary. Some of the things I was saying there about collaboration, preventing defects, vertical stories, valuable stories, small stories being two key ones from INVEST, the blend there of automation for early feedback and for regression with exploratory, the importance of test-driven early testing, test written first, cases and examples are almost synonymous. Be careful of the word acceptance and make sure you're all using it in the same way in your organization, and don't get blinkered by stories. Consider higher levels as well and how stories interact with each other. Here's a shameless plug. We're doing some ISTQB virtual stuff coming up. I've already done both the Foundation and the Agile Tester for, remotely, virtually live, and I'm amazed at you know, how well they're going. And also got some Scrum training coming up too, if you want to look at the website. So that's pretty much it from me.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely packed with tips, techniques, insight, absolutely fabulous stuff. We have got some questions and we've got a few minutes, so hopefully I can actually cover a few of those. Lita here, is psychological testing enough as one of the requirements in any company with the follow-up interview?
Say that one more time.
Is psychological testing enough as one of the requirements in any company with the follow-up interview?
So we're talking about recruitment, and we're talking about psychological tests of people potentially to recruit as testers in a follow-up interview, and is it enough?
Sounds like it, yes.
Okay, well, enough for what purpose, I guess. So psychological is obviously going to address certain aspects, you know, and from the point of view of tester, there's certain kind of personality traits and so on that are going to be very valuable: curiosity, lateral thinking, attention to detail, all these kind of things. So, you know, from a psychological assessment, you could maybe glean information that will be supportive in terms of allocation of people to the appropriate role. So, you know, it's all good stuff, you know what I mean, to be doing that kind of stuff after, let's say, you've done some initial screening and you're getting into more detail. But to me, what's even more important is two things really. It's attitude in the first place, so that you may or may not get that from a psychological test. The attitude in terms of the interest in and the kind of self-starting and the curiosity and so on that you can glean in terms of interviews, and in terms of as well. Then the next thing I was going to talk about was people demonstrating their work, actually giving people you know, tasks to perform to see how to get on. Okay, design some tests for that, explore that bit of software, and then, you know, getting them to talk as they're doing it. You can really evaluate, I think, a lot from the point of view of actually getting people to, as I say, demonstrate certain capabilities rather than assume they have it from a CV. So I think it's a blend, I think would be my answer to that question. I don't think it's enough. I think it's a blend.
Yes, Lisa says thank you very much. You're very right, and the most important thing is attitude. Very good point there. Fran, how would you recommend dealing with non-functional stories?
Yeah, non-functional are pretty tricky. We're talking here about performance. We're talking about usability, all the utilities, and they've always been hard because it's been difficult. We've been difficult to define them in a testable way, in a measurable way. They've been vague, like the system must be user-friendly. Like, what the hell does that mean? And the extra problem with Agile is the fact that we, you know, are working incrementally. So do we wait till the very end and then do one big performance test of the whole system? That's not very fast feedbacky, inspect and adapt. So, you know, the answer to that is no. We're going to try and find ways to get faster feedback. So we first need to try and identify the requirement, put it into our product backlog, try and make that requirement as concrete as possible. For example, in usability, we might break it down into certain usability requirements. by using, there's a standard ISO 25010 that I'd highly recommend people have a look at if they're non-functional as an area for them. It breaks down these non-functional areas into their sub-characteristics, like usability breaks down to things like learnability, user error protection, and operability, and so on, accessibility. So it becomes more tangible then in terms of defining requirements for them. Okay, so if that's the case, they can be implemented as requirements, 3 clicks to get to any piece of information on your website. There's a hard requirement, you can test it. But in other situations, like in performance, for example, it may be that it's a constraint that you have to bear in mind when you're developing functional stories. So, you know, a functional story results in code and tests. A non-functional story results in tests. So we want to test for that constraint. So we can leave it till the end and do a big performance test, but a much better way to do it is to do performance testing incrementally. So how do you do that? You can do things like performance profiling of key bits of code. You can put benchmarking in place, and as you develop functional stories, make sure the performance doesn't degrade below the benchmark. But increasingly in DevOps, for example, you're seeing continuous performance testing. So you know, so we develop and deploy low volume load tests, you know, to capture performance metrics, you know, of critical user flows in your application, or API endpoints, or database queries, you know, which are key areas to target from the point of view of performance checks. You know, and we don't necessarily do full level stressing, but we gain enough information and enough fast feedback to mitigate that risk incrementally as we go along in an agile life cycle. So there are a few points, you know, and keep them in mind, stick them up on the wall so that you bear them in mind as you're developing your functional stories. Develop tests for them and do them frequently and in an integrated manner, put them into your regression pack and so on. But yeah, NFRs are never easy.
I'm going to go straight through into the next question because we've got quite a few coming through. From Shay, any advice on automating BDD tests on multi-tiered systems with different back-end components, not simple web applications?
In a word, no. It's not my area of expertise, as they'd say. I'd focus more on the process and the people and the culture and so on. I'm not a techie in that respect, so I'm afraid I'm no help to you there.
Oh, very honest answer, Fran. Question here from Shilpi, and she asked this when you had the slide up about ATDD. What is the benefit of doing automation?
Yeah, I think I kind of alluded to it in terms of, you know, the main reason we do it is to address our regression risk. So, yeah, you know, in Agile, we have lots of change, and therefore every time we change something, how do we know we haven't broken the rest of the stuff? We don't, so we need to do regression testing. So if we do it manually, that effort is just going to consume us as we move from sprint to sprint, because there's more and more functionality to be regression tested. So we have to automate to address the regression problem, the cost of it, the time of it, and the risk of it. So from that point of view, you know, automation is key to address that problem. Otherwise, we cannot maintain our velocity moving forward. So, you know, the trick is, and the other reason, of course, we want to do it is to get fast feedback. So a developer writing a unit test, you know, is going to run that unit test. They write it first, they write the code, and they run the test, and it checks whether that code is doing what they intended to do, if they're doing TDD, test-driven development, at the unit level. So that is rapid feedback from an automated unit test. And then you know whether that bit of code is doing what you intended it to do. So fast feedback is one way. So if we can easily and quickly write tests at a unit level, at a component level, at an API level, and so on, then happy days, do it. But also consider the value of approaches like exploratory and the mix between the two. Yeah, I'm not sure if I've answered that, but yeah, the main reasons, I guess, are to address the regression problem and give us fast feedback. And it's pretty much, it's key as part of a DevOps approach, of course, as well. When you have a deployment pipeline and you make a change and then you kick off your whole continuous integration, continuous deployment type set of activities and automated tests. So you're building, you're deploying, you're running automated tests, functional, non-functional, and getting rapid feedback on every change you make. And then you can decide, do you want continuous delivery, continuous deployment in terms of putting those out to production with maybe feature toggles, or do you kind of collect up a bunch of changes until they get UAT'd and then deploy it in more kind of traditional kind of release mode? But the whole point is that automation is a key part of DevOps. However, even with DevOps, and particularly in the early stages, there will be lots of manual steps involved there as well. Like code review is a manual process. A lot of, you know, UAT is a manual process, and so on and so on. So automation is key, but it's not the goal.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. We're just going to rattle through a couple more. A couple here about the webinar and recording. Yes, we will share it. We'll send it to people who registered for the webinar, and we'll also put it onto our YouTube and social media channels. Question here about the ISTQB advanced level Agile technical tester is available. Yes, the exam is available. You'll find that on the ISQI website. Training providers are just starting to develop their materials at the moment, so expect to see some training providers offering that, I guess, in the near future. And one final question for you, Fran, here. Have you any ideas how to stop the team writing technical stories?
Technical stories. Yeah. When I was talking there about value and creating vertical slices as opposed to technical, I guess you don't want to stop them. You know, you want to talk about, you know, there are certain types of stories that are best left as technical stories. You know, it's like, you know, if you're going to have stories to develop some tooling for the team as for testing, for example, that's a kind of a technical product backlog item. You may or may not call it a story. You're going to have technical debt items for refactoring in there potentially as well. Obviously bugs are in there, so there's going to be a lot of stuff that isn't a use story. But the key one, I think, is the technical stories that relate to product infrastructure, to relate to the architecture, the layers, the technical layers, and trying to minimize jumping to those kind of technical stories in your product backlog. Ideally, the stories get sliced smaller so that they end up just being tasked in a sprint to address a user story. So how can you convince them? Well, you can talk about the benefits like we just talked about there. In terms of overcoming resistance, one thing that I think helps a lot is not to tell the team what to do, but to just phrase it frame it in terms of, well, look, why don't we try this for a couple of sprints? And then you can see, people get to see the benefit of it when they actually do it. Look at other teams that are using it and see what their experience has been with it, But don't let difficulty slicing be the reason why your team uses technical stories. Get better at, experiment with, get expertise in to get better at slicing vertical stories, so that is not the reason why you jump to technical stories. There may be perfectly valid reasons why you may have to put a bit of infrastructure in place to support the development of functional stories subsequently. It's a question of degree. If I look at my product backlog, I want the majority of stuff in there to be user-focused, value-focused, supported by other more technical stories, as opposed to the other way around.
Perfect. We're really out of time. I've got some more questions coming through, but I don't think we've got time to answer them. We'll see if we can get back to some people with specific questions. I think just to end this, I'll say Yusra, he says, Yusra here, amazing and informative session, thank you. And I couldn't say it better myself.
Right, thank you.
That was fantastic. A great webinar, and hopefully you'll come back and you'll do another one for us soon. Take care, everyone. Take care, Fran. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.